When he walked onto the AGT stage, the room didn't fall silent in awe. It filled with something else, a low murmur, a shuffle of feet, the faint sound of polite curiosity mixed with quiet doubt. He paused just behind the curtain, fingers trembling as he brushed them against his jeans. The lights were brighter than he imagined, almost blinding. They washed over him like a spotlight on every insecurity he'd spent years trying to hide. For a moment, he wondered if he should turn back. No one would stop him, no one would blame him. After all, the world had never expected much from him. He stepped forward anyway. From the audience he must have looked unremarkable. A man with average height, ordinary clothes, and a smile that didn't quite know where to settle. It wasn't the confident grin of someone who knew they belonged. It was the kind of smile you learn after a lifetime of being told, without words, that you don't. The camera caught it immediately, that nervous smile. The kind people mistake for weakness, the kind that comes from surviving disappointment without becoming bitter. As he reached the center of the stage, he took a slow breath, the way his mother had taught him years ago. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She used to say it helped when fear felt bigger than faith. She wasn't there anymore, but her voice still was. The judges looked up from their notes. One of them offered a polite nod. Another leaned back in their chair, arms crossed, not unkindly, just unconvinced. They had seen thousands like him, people with big dreams and small chances, people who walked in believing talent alone would save them. The audience clapped, lightly, not the roar reserved for favorites, not the electric buzz of expectation, just courtesy. He introduced himself, his voice catching slightly on his name. The microphone felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried every doubt he'd ever swallowed. He told them where he was from, how long he'd been singing. He didn't mention the nights he practiced quietly, so he wouldn't wake anyone. He didn't talk about the jobs he worked just to afford the bus fare to auditions that never called back. He kept those parts to himself, because he was used to doing things alone. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered, "He looks nervous." Someone else chuckled softly, not out of cruelty, but assumption. The assumption that people like him were here for a story, not a moment. What they didn't see was the road that led him here, the years of being the background voice, the one who sang at family gatherings while everyone talked over him, the one who gave up his turn so others could shine, the one who believed, quietly, stubbornly, that kindness mattered more than recognition. He had learned early that the world listens louder to confidence than to sincerity. But sincerity was all he had, and he brought it anyway. As he stood there, waiting for the judges to speak, memories flooded in uninvited. The first time someone laughed when he said he wanted to sing. The teacher who suggested something more realistic. The friend who meant well but said, "People like us don't make it that way." People like us. He had heard that phrase his whole life, yet somehow it never stopped him from dreaming. Because every time doubt knocked, compassion answered. A neighbor who asked him to sing at a small event. A stranger who slipped him $1 and said, "Don't stop." A family member who stayed up late just to listen. Those moments didn't make headlines, but they made him. The judges asked him why he was here. He swallowed, to sing. He said, simple, honest, unprotected. A ripple of laughter rolled through parts of the audience. Not loud enough to be cruel, but loud enough to sting. It was the sound of expectations lowering. He nodded gently as if he understood, because he did. He had stood in rooms like this before. Rooms where people decided who you were before you ever opened your mouth. Rooms where appearances spoke louder than truth. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't asking to be believed. He was just asking to be heard. As the music cue hovered in the air, waiting, he closed his eyes for half a second. In that tiny space between silence and sound, he made a promise, not to the judges, not to the audience, but to himself. Sing the way you always have. Sing with kindness. Sing like this is a gift, not a test. The lights dimmed slightly, the crowd settled, the moment stretched, fragile and full of possibility. They didn't take him seriously, not yet, but everything was about to change. The laughter didn't crash through the room like thunder. It drifted in softly, like a breeze that still found a way under his skin. A few scattered chuckles, a couple of amused smiles, the kind of reaction that wasn't meant to hurt, but did anyway, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. He had heard that sound before. It echoed in classrooms when he raised his hand, in break rooms when he mentioned his dream, in living rooms when relatives exchanged glances instead of encouragement. That sound meant, "We don't see you." The judges exchanged looks. One leaned forward, curious but guarded. Another tapped a pen against the desk, already imagining how this might end, not cruel, just efficient. This show moved fast, and hope didn't always make the cut. So, one judge said gently, tilting their head, "Tell us why you chose this song." He hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the truth felt too fragile to speak aloud. He cleared his throat. The microphone picked up the smallest shake in his breath. "It's a song I used to sing when things were hard," he said, a few nods, polite interest. What he didn't say was how hard. He didn't talk about the nights he came home exhausted, voice worn thin from hours of singing quietly to himself, just to remember who he was. He didn't mention the bills stacked on the table, or the sacrifices made without applause. He didn't explain how singing was the only place he felt honest. Instead, he stood there, shoulders slightly rounded, hands folded together, not in fear but in respect. The audience shifted. Someone whispered, "He looks nervous." He was. But not because of the stage. He was nervous because this moment mattered more than anyone realized. A judge smiled kindly. "Are you confident?" The question landed heavier than it sounded. Confidence had always been a complicated word for him. He had never walked into a room expecting to be the best, but he had learned something quieter, something stronger. Belief, yes, he said finally. "I believe in this song." Not in himself, not in the outcome. In the song, another ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, softer this time, almost affectionate, as if they'd already decided he was sweet, but not serious, and that was the hardest kind of dismissal. Because sweetness didn't protect you from being forgotten. He nodded again, absorbing the moment the way he always had, without resistance, without resentment. Somewhere deep inside, disappointment tried to rise. He gently pushed it down. He reminded himself of why he was here, not to be perfect, not to be famous, but to honor the voice that carried him through his darkest days. A judge raised an eyebrow. "You know this is a big stage, right?" He smiled. "Yes," he said softly, "that's why I came." The audience laughed again, but this time something shifted. A few people clapped lightly. Someone in the back whispered, "I like him." That was how it always started. A crack in expectation, a pause in judgment. The music technician signaled readiness. The pianist adjusted their seat. The room felt suddenly too quiet, like everyone was holding something they didn't know how to name. He took a breath, not the shallow kind that comes with fear, but the deep, steady kind that comes from acceptance. If this was the end, he would make it honest. He closed his eyes briefly, and for a moment, he wasn't on the AGT stage anymore. He was in his childhood kitchen, singing softly while his mother cooked. He was on a bus ride home after a long shift, humming to himself so the world felt kinder. He was standing in a small room, helping a friend smile through a hard day with nothing but a song. Those moments had never asked for applause. They had only asked for heart. When he opened his eyes, the judges were watching him more closely now, not convinced, but curious. Curiosity was enough. The laughter faded. The room settled, phones lowered, whispers stopped. In the fragile quiet before the music began, he felt something he hadn't felt when he first walked out. Respect, not given, but possible. The kind that waits on truth. The kind that listens. The judge nodded toward him. "Whenever you're ready." He adjusted the microphone. His hands stopped shaking. His shoulders relaxed. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about finally letting himself be right. As the first note hovered just beyond silence, the audience leaned forward. Without realizing why, the judges straightened in their chairs. The air changed, thick with anticipation. They didn't know it yet. But the laughter was over, and the silence that followed was about to change everything. The music began almost imperceptibly, a single chord, soft, cautious, hung in the air like a question no one had answered yet. The lights dimmed just enough for the stage to feel smaller, more intimate, as if the massive theater had gently leaned closer. He closed his eyes, not for drama, not for courage, but for grounding. In that brief darkness, the noise of the world faded. The expectations, the laughter, the weight of being underestimated, all of it fell quiet. What remained was something simpler, older, truer, the reason he had fallen in love with singing in the first place. Then he opened his mouth, and the first note emerged. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was pure. The sound moved through the room slowly, deliberately, like warm light spilling through a cracked door. It carried a depth that no one had prepared for, rich with ache, softened by hope. The audience froze, someone mid-whisper stopped speaking, a hand halfway to a phone lowered. A judge who had been leaning back straightened without realizing it. The laughter didn't fade, it disappeared, because that note didn't ask permission. It told a story. There was weariness in it, the kind that comes from years of pushing forward when the road never clears. There was tenderness, shaped by kindness given even when none was returned. And beneath it all there was strength, not the loud kind, but the kind that survives. His voice didn't try to impress, it invited. As the melody unfolded, the room seemed to breathe with him. Each word landed gently, but firmly, as if he had lived inside them for years, because he had. This wasn't a performance polished for television. This was a truth he had been carrying alone. One judge blinked slowly, eyes fixed on the stage. Another pressed their lips together, something unspoken stirring behind their expression. They weren't listening like critics anymore. They were listening like humans. The second line of the song rose slightly, and with it, his confidence, not the showy kind, but the steady confidence of someone finally standing in their own voice. His shoulders loosened. His grip on the microphone softened. The tension that had wrapped itself around him since the curtain lifted began to unravel. The audience leaned in, not because they were told to, but because something inside them recognized something inside him. Pain, hope, the quiet courage of continuing anyway. His voice cracked just slightly on one note, not from fear but from feeling. Instead of breaking the moment, it deepened it. That small imperfection made the song breathe. It made it human. A woman in the crowd wiped her eyes, surprised by her own reaction. A man nodded slowly, as if the words were answering a question he hadn't known how to ask. This was no longer about talent. It was about connection. As the song reached its chorus, the music swelled, but his voice stayed grounded, steady, honest. He sang not at the audience, but with them. Every note carried the weight of unseen sacrifices, early mornings, late nights, helping others before helping himself. And suddenly, people understood. This man hadn't come to be famous. He had come to be faithful, to his gift, to his past, to everyone who ever told him, just keep going. One judge's eyes glistened, another leaned forward, elbows on the desk now, completely engaged. The skepticism that once sat between them and the stage had dissolved into something fragile and rare. Respect. The room felt different, charged, reverent. Even the air seemed to vibrate with meaning. As he sang the final line, his voice softened again, returning to where it began. The note lingered, gentle, trembling, not wanting to leave, and when it ended, silence, not the awkward kind, the sacred kind. A silence so full it felt louder than applause. For a heartbeat no one moved. Then someone exhaled, long and shaky. A single clap rang out, then another and another. The sound grew, not rushed, not explosive, but rising, like understanding spreading through the crowd. He opened his eyes. For the first time that night, he really looked at the audience, and he saw it, not doubt, not amusement, but wonder. His chest tightened, his throat burned, not from singing, but from realization. They were listening, they had heard him. He hadn't changed who he was. He hadn't asked them to believe. He had simply sung his truth, and that was enough. As the applause swelled, he lowered the microphone slightly, overwhelmed, not by noise, but by the feeling of being seen after a lifetime of invisibility. The judges exchanged glances. not the polite kind anymore, but the kind that says, "Something just happened here." They didn't know yet how far this moment would travel, how many homes it would reach, how many quiet dreamers it would awaken, but everyone in that room felt it, the moment when underestimation met authenticity, and lost. This was the first note, and it had changed everything. The applause didn't crash in all at once. It rose, slowly at first, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again after being held too long. A few claps became many. Many became a wave that rolled from the front, rose to the back of the theater, lifting people to their feet before they fully understood why. One judge stood, then another, then all of them. The standing ovation wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polite. It was instinctive, the body responding before the mind could catch up. For a moment, the room forgot it was a competition. Forgot the cameras, forgot the rules. What remained was recognition. He stood frozen at center stage, the microphone lowered slightly, unsure of what to do with his hands. He hadn't prepared for this part. In his mind, he had rehearsed walking off quietly, maybe with a gentle smile and a respectful nod. He had not rehearsed being seen. The lights felt warmer now, less harsh, or maybe it was the way his chest burned, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to joy. One judge shook their head slowly, eyes still locked on him. Another wiped beneath their eye, laughing softly at themselves. The toughest judge, the one known for brutal honesty, leaned forward, hands pressed together, staring at the stage like they were afraid to look away. When the applause finally softened enough for voices to be heard, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. "I wasn't expecting that," one judge said, voice low and sincere. "At all." The audience laughed gently, not at him this time, but with the honesty of the moment. He swallowed hard. The judge continued, "You walked out here, and I'll be honest. I made assumptions." That word landed like a confession. "We all do," the judge added, "but then you sang and suddenly, none of that mattered." Another judge leaned into their microphone. "You didn't just sing a song," they said, "you shared a life." He felt his eyes sting. He hadn't come prepared to defend himself. He hadn't come with a story meant to pull heartstrings, but somehow the truth had done that on its own. The third judge smiled warmly. "There was kindness in your voice," they said. "That's rare, and it's powerful. Kindness." The word echoed inside him. That was what his mother used to say when the world felt unkind. Sing kindly, live kindly, even when no one's watching. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. The final judge, quiet until now, spoke slowly. "People think strength is about being loud," they said, "but what you showed us tonight, that was strength." The audience erupted again. This time, the applause felt different to him. It wasn't approval, it was connection. For the first time, he wasn't standing alone in his dream. The host walked onto the stage, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "How does this feel?" they asked. He exhaled, shaky but steady. "It feels," he said, pausing to find the right word, "like being listened to." That answer drew another wave of emotion through the room. Somewhere in the audience, a young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, eyes wide. A woman held her phone to her chest instead of recording, afraid to miss the moment by trying to capture it. The judges exchanged glances again, this time with purpose. "You know," one said, "there are a lot of people watching at home tonight who have been told they're not enough." He nodded. "And you just showed them." The judge continued, "that being underestimated doesn't mean being wrong." The words hit him harder than applause ever could. He thought of the years he spent helping others while his own dreams waited quietly. Of choosing responsibility over recognition. Of believing that if he stayed kind long enough, the world might eventually listen. It had, not because he demanded it, but because he stayed true. The host raised an eyebrow playfully. "So," they said, "are you ready to hear what we think?" The audience laughed, nerves breaking like a wave. He nodded again. One by one, the judges gave their votes. Each yes landed like a door opening, slowly, carefully, but unmistakably forward. With every vote, the crowd cheered louder, as if celebrating not just his success, but the idea behind it. When the final vote came, the judge smiled and said, "This is the easiest yes I've given all season." The crowd exploded. He covered his mouth, overwhelmed. Tears slipped free not from victory, but from release. Years of holding it together finally had permission to loosen. As confetti began to fall, he looked out at the audience once more, not as strangers, but as witnesses. Witnesses to the moment kindness met courage. Witnesses to the truth that compassion doesn't need confidence to be powerful. Witnesses to a reminder the world desperately needs, that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, and if you listen closely, it can change everything. Long after the lights dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling, the moment stayed. It stayed in the way the audience exited the theater more slowly than usual, conversations hushed, eyes thoughtful. It stayed in the judges' expressions as they returned to their chairs, not rushing to the next act, still carrying what they had just witnessed, and it stayed in him. Backstage, the noise softened into distant echoes, applause dissolving into memory, excitement giving way to something gentler. He sat alone on a bench, hands resting in his lap, staring at the floor as if afraid the moment might vanish if he looked too hard at it. For years, he had imagined success as something loud, bright, overwhelming, but this felt different. This felt like peace. A producer passed by and smiled. "You changed the room out there," they said casually, before disappearing down the hall. He let the words settle. Change the room. He thought about how many rooms had never changed for him. Rooms where he stayed quiet so others could speak. Rooms where dreams were folded neatly away so responsibilities could take center stage. Rooms where kindness was offered freely but rarely returned. And yet he had kept singing, not because it guaranteed anything, but because it kept him whole. As he stood to leave, he caught his reflection in a mirror along the corridor. The same face, the same simple clothes, but his eyes looked different now, not proud, not triumphant. He looked lighter. Outside the theater, people were still gathered. Strangers, fans, dreamers. A woman approached him, her voice trembling. "My daughter wants to sing," she said. "She's scared. I'm going to show her what you did tonight." He nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Tell her to sing anyway," he replied softly. A man shook his hand and said, "I gave up on my dream years ago. I don't know why your voice reminded me of it, but thank you." He didn't have an answer for that. All he could offer was presence. That night, clips of his performance traveled farther than he ever had. Across cities, across states, across living rooms where people sat quietly on couches, feeling something stir they thought they'd lost. They didn't all talk about technique. They talked about honesty. About the way his voice sounded like someone who had lived, not performed. About how kindness could be heard, not just seen. In a small apartment miles away, someone turned off the TV and whispered, "Maybe it's not too late." And that was the real victory. Days later, the messages kept coming. Teachers writing about students who felt invisible. Parents sharing stories of children who finally raised their hands. People saying, "I saw myself in him." He read them slowly, carefully, afraid to rush through something so sacred. He didn't reply to all of them, but he held every word because he knew what it meant to feel unseen. When he returned home, life didn't suddenly become perfect. Bills still arrived. Responsibilities still waited. The world didn't rearrange itself overnight, but something inside him had shifted. He walked with his head a little higher, not out of pride, but out of permission. Permission to believe that his voice mattered, not because millions had heard it, but because it had been true all along. In quiet moments, he thought about the laughter that came before the silence, how easy it was to underestimate someone, how often kindness went unnoticed because it didn't demand attention. And he made himself a promise to keep singing, to keep choosing compassion, even when it was easier to harden, to remember that sometimes the smallest acts, a song, a word, a moment of belief, could ripple farther than applause ever could. For the people watching at home, his story became a mirror, a reminder that the world doesn't always recognize potential at first glance, that strength doesn't always enter the room confidently, that humanity, real humanity, often arrives quietly, hoping someone will listen. And when someone does, everything changes. The message wasn't about winning a show. It was about listening before judging, about believing before dismissing, About understanding that every voice carries a story, and some of the most powerful ones belong to those who've waited the longest to be heard. He had walked onto that stage underestimated. He walked off understood, and somewhere in countless homes hearts felt a little braver, dreams felt a little closer, kindness felt a little stronger, because sometimes all it takes is one voice, one moment, one act of humanity, to remind the world who we can be.